Hello, good evening and a very warm welcome to our latest webinar on feeding the poor doer. My name is Katie Williams. I'm Technical and Product Development Manager here at Dengie, a role I've done for over 18 years now. And this evening I'm joined by some long-serving members of the nutrition team, Tracy Hammond, who's just popped up on your screen, and Claire Akers. If you can't see them, they're on the photo as well on the slide. So it will, as ever, be a triple act for our webinar this evening. Following the same format as previous Express webinars, I'm going to set the scene with some sort of core concepts and principles, and in this case, looking at the digestive system and how we can try and maximise its efficiency. And then Tracy and Claire are going to talk you through how to use the Dengie products and with some case study examples, which I know you'll find interesting. There's some really interesting horses to talk about. As ever, there's going to be a recording of the webinar available on our YouTube channel, and all the previous recordings are there already. So if you've missed our previous webinars, you can watch them at your leisure, including the ones from last year as well, which were a lot longer, so you might want to take several sittings to view those. Whilst we just give a few more seconds to people to join, I'd like to mention some forthcoming webinars as well. On Thursday, the 20th of January, we have an evening with Anna and Alex, more fully known as Anna Miller and Alex Bragg. So we're going to talk about some of their key horses, some of the training tips. Obviously, Anna's a specialist in dressage and Alex eventing, so we're going to cover those two disciplines, ranging from baby youngsters right the way through to some advanced horses. So that should be a fascinating evening. I'm sure we'll cover some nutrition and feeding along there. I shall make sure we do anyway. And then on the 3rd of February, the focus is going to turn to native. So we're very lucky to be joined by Sylvia Ormiston and Lizzie Bryant, who respectively breed and show for the Queen, the Royal Stud of Balmoral, breed Highland ponies. So we're going to hear a lot more about them. And so do join us for those if you can. Again, they will be recorded if you can't make those specific dates. But back to this evening, and if you do have any questions, just a bit of housekeeping etiquette, if you can put them in the Q&A rather than the chat box, it does mean if we don't get to answer them for you tonight, we can see them and respond to you tomorrow, and the Feedline team will be on the case to help you. So we will try to do some tonight, but if we don't get through them all, if they're in the Q&A, we can retrieve them. If you put them in chat, we don't get them afterwards, so try and avoid that if you can. So without further ado, we're going to cover off feeding the underweight horse, and as you can see there, the nutrition team, there's 3/5 of us with you tonight, and then Katie and Polly are the other members of the team that you may well come across if you do contact Feedline. So that's us basically. So some key concepts to start with, and the first question we've got to ask ourselves really is why is this horse underweight that we're presented with? So is it something like poor dentition, or is it just simply not being fed enough for the work that it's performing? Or is there an underlying problem that we can address effectively? So will dental management help alleviate the problem? And if we then feed it more for the work it's doing, they can be simply resolved. But there are some sort of chronic issues that we can't undo. So if a horse is simply old and things are worn out and teeth have fallen out, no matter how much dental care you provide, if they're missing teeth, they're always going to have a challenge eating, and we'll focus on that a bit more later on. So those are the sort of things we're going to be looking at. If it's something we can remedy simply, great. If not, what are the strategies that we can implement for managing that chronic problem? And I'm going to apologise in advance because I always interchangeably use energy and calories. Now, they're exactly the same thing. Calories is a terminology, I guess, we use to try and refer to weight gain, weight loss. And then we tend to talk about energy in terms of fueling a horse and giving it energy to do the work it requires. They're both the same thing. So the type of energy we provide could be slow release or quick release. And Tracy's going to talk about the link between that and behaviour in particular later on. But effectively, if we want to promote weight gain, we have to put more energy in than is being used, and that's when we're going to achieve weight gain. Okay, so you can't condition a horse without putting more energy into them. It's the form of energy that's potentially going to have an impact on behaviour. So hopefully that just sets the scene. When we think about conditioning the horse and promoting weight gain, we've got to understand their digestive system, because effectively something isn't working particularly well and that's why the horse, is going to be underweight. And it's our job, usually when we're working as a nutritionist, we're trying to find the balance between health and performance. Now, performance might be hacking around the countryside, or it might be performing a race or a 3-day event, but that's our challenge. We've got to get the diet right so that the horse is healthy, it keeps the gut healthy to perform properly and normally, and then that enables the horse to perform whatever function we're asking of it. So that is a balance that, as a nutritionist and to some extent horse owners, we're obviously always trying to achieve. So we'll take a little bit of a tour through the digestive system. You can see it sort of in situ there, but obviously the whole process begins in the mouth. And in the case of biting and chewing, it's a mechanical digestion. So we're physically breaking the feed down into smaller particles. Now, as soon as that chewing process is compromised for some reason, the horse is potentially having to consume larger particles of feed, and that has a knock-on effect all the way through the rest of the digestive process. Okay, the bigger particles we put in, the less efficient the digestive process will be. Now, we often think of poor dentition as being a problem for older horses, so things like loose and wobbly teeth, or the horses now outliving its teeth quite commonly, but they aren't just issues that affect older horses. These days we have problems like diastemas, which are being increasingly diagnosed. They might have always been there and we just didn't know about it, but we're certainly diagnosing them more frequently. So that's the abnormal gaps between teeth that can present problems for horses when they're chewing. But also there's this another sort of disease, if you like, called EOTRH, which tends to affect the incisors at the front of the mouth. And that's the reason for sort of putting it on here, really. It's a relatively unusual disease, but seems to, again, be increasing. And it's something that affects the incisors. Now, normally the incisors will sort of last and function unless a horse cribs, windsucks, and to some extent these days they can be eroded by use of grazing muzzles, because they're kind of scraping against the muzzle quite a lot when they're grazing and eating. And usually dental problems or ineffective dentition has been a problem for the molars, so further back in the horse's mouth that you can see on the diagram there. But actually now we have these other issues cropping up. Sometimes we're faced with the incisors not functioning properly as well. So those are two different areas that we'll consider as we go through. Now, the incisors' job is to bite and sort of grasp the food and then use the tongue to manipulate it back into the mouth, and that's when the molars will then grind it down into smaller particles. And effectively, we are aiming for every horse at least to have 1.5% of its body weight in forage every day. If you're feeding ad lib, it will potentially be anywhere up to 3-4% in some greedy pony cases, and 2% will be the sort of normal level that we tend to talk about. But 1.5% should be the minimum to try and maintain a normal, healthy digestive system. And that's on a dry matter basis. So if you're considering it in the format of grass or forages that are wetter, then you will actually have to feed more, because the dry matter is basically diluted by that extra water. So that is something to bear in mind when you have horses with poor dentition or compromised dentition, in that the wetter or more dilute the forage, the more of it they actually have to consume. So Tracy's going to expand on this in a bit more detail, but effectively we did a study a few years ago now, and horses with poor dentition consumed about 2/3 less in the same time period compared to those with normal dentition. So just to put some numbers to that, if a horse consumed 2 kilos rather than 6 kilos, which they should be consuming, for example, of an average hay, their energy intake is going to be around 40 megajoules lower. Now, a megajoule is 1,000,000 joules, so that's a huge amount of energy that they're missing out on just simply because they can't consume the sort of forage and average hay in the same time frame. And this is a really important thing to bear in mind if you do have older horses or those with poor teeth grazing communally with others, because they are going to be eating much slower. So although there looks like there's plenty of forage out there, the ones that can chew it and eat it much more quickly and easily are going to be gobbling it up and potentially stopping the one with poor dentition from consuming their fair share. So do give them more time. If you need to, separate them off so they get their allocation of forage, because just consuming, your 2/3 less could have a huge impact on their body weight and condition. And if the teeth get so bad, the team are going to talk you through what we can do in the form of short chops or pelleted fibres to act as alternatives that are much easier for them to manage. So there have been some studies looking at impacts of sort of dentition and diet. And when we've looked into the sort of, I suppose, the benefits of fibre feeding, really, the studies have sort of shown that eating and chewing fibre actually requires more force from the muscles in the mouth, the masseter muscles in the cheek. They're applying more force, and actually that has a positive impact on the amount of saliva produced as well. So there's a literal relationship between the amount of force and the amount of saliva. Now, saliva lubricates and obviously makes the feed easier to swallow. It does also have some buffering potential. So in the context of gastric ulcers, you get more saliva produced per chew, if you like, of forage than you do cereal-based feeds or things that have been pelleted and easier to break down. But also the other repercussion of chewing more properly is that they use the full range of movement. So it's a sort of sideways motion across the teeth. And the research is showing that if you're feeding cereals, it doesn't encourage them to use that full range of movement. And that's why you get those sort of sharp edges or enamel overgrowths forming. Now, obviously, regular dental treatment and management will rasp those away, and the horse should be able to chew no problem at all. But if you don't implement those, that good management and good practice, then that's another potential reason why the horse may struggle to chew. Some signs of dental issues. The most common one we talk about is quidding, so the balled up pieces of forage that the horse may spend quite a long time chewing and still not getting anywhere small enough to swallow, which in some ways is a good thing because we don't really want them to risk choking or impaction colics through eating too bigger particles. And you'll see these are forming around the base of a hay net or potentially out in the field as well if they're on very long grass. So that's something to watch out for, and obviously you need to take action if that's happening. Some slightly more scientific and perhaps less pleasant ways of looking to see how well your horse is chewing, and this is mainly done in obviously research trials, is looking at the fibre length coming through in the faeces at the other end. And studies in horses have shown that pieces longer than 3.6 millimetres are used as an indicator of dental abnormalities or ineffective chewing. Some follow-up studies looking at donkeys actually found a correlation with longer pieces of above 3.3 mils and dental elongation, so teeth getting long and not working as efficiently as they can. So if you fancy measuring fecal fibre lengths and pieces that are coming through, you have some markers, but it's just interesting that those are the sorts of lengths we're talking about when looking at dental efficiency. So when there's a problem, they're consuming things that are more than 3.6 or passing through things, sorry, more than 3.6 mils long. From the mouth, and that's, as we said, it's the mechanical digestion in the mouth, and then from that point onwards, the digestive system is effectively a long muscular tube with various enlargements along the way. And you can see here a horse's stomach. Now, the stomach and the cecum in the hindgut are basically big sort of or enlargements along the way. So the cecum is much, much bigger than the stomach. The stomach is relatively small, but they are designed to be a sac-like structure, if you like, that just slows the rate of passage. So rather than it being a long tube, which the small intestine tends to be like, these enlargements are designed to slow the food long enough to try and promote digestion. Now, this matters in the context of meal size, because as soon as we start to feed more than the capacity of the gut, the less efficient the digesting process is, because it just passes through much more quickly. And we know that the digestive enzymes that the horse produces itself, but in particular the microbes further back in the hindgut, they need time to break things down. If everything's shooting through, they don't have enough time, and then the digestive process is compromised. So that gives you a bit of an insight into the size of the horse's stomach. It is not very big and it's not very stretchy, so it has a limited capacity. And that's where that very basic rule of feeding little and often comes from, because we just can't overload the system if we want to maintain a healthy, normal functioning digestive system. Now, we do have some chemical digestion going on in the stomach. So there are obviously enzymes. The acid itself is helping to break down the food. And as we know, if there's too much acid, it can increase the risk of gastric ulcers. So yes, meal size has to be kept small, but that's in the context of cereal-based feeds. If we are feeding fibre and fibrous materials, we can try and effectively replicate what would happen in nature, which is a pretty much continuous trickle, hence the term trickle feeder, of fibre being taken into the digestive tract. And in its natural environment, the horse would be spending 16 to 18 hours of every day. So in this context, tonight we're talking about the poor doer, we would always advocate feeding ad lib forage because there's no reason to limit them. It's only good doers where we would want to control their calorie or energy intake by reducing the amount of food they have available. In this context, if we can feed as good a fibre and a good quality forage as possible that they can digest, that's how their gut's designed to function. And again, coming back to this health and performance balance, the more we can increase the reliance on fibre, the less we have to use cereals, the healthier the gut will be, and the reduced risk of things like ulcers, colic, laminitis. So yes, first sort of take-home message really is that basic rule of feeding is still very important and still applies today. So the small intestine, and here on the image we have a really highly magnified image of the lining of the small intestine. So we know that horses aren't particularly well adapted to high starch diets. Now research in other species has shown that this what you can see here, these villi, the little finger-like projections, when the gut is very acidic, the size of those villi actually decreases, so they wither away. And the importance of the villi is that they are helping to increase the absorption capacity. So the small intestine is where we're seeing things like protein, starch, fats and oils, they're being absorbed in the small intestine. It is the site of absorption. So by having these villi, we're increasing the surface area. So in humans, if we lay our small intestine out and flatten out all these villi, the surface area is actually the size of about a tennis court. And roughly speaking, the horse's small intestine is around 3 times longer than ours, at sort of 20, 25 meters long. So, if you level those out in a healthy gut, you're probably looking at about 3 tennis courts of surface area for absorption. And if we wither those away because the gut's acidic and we compromise the health and integrity of the lining of the gut, we're just simply reducing that absorption capacity. And as soon as we reduce that, the horse just isn't getting as much from its diet as it was or should be. And that's when we start to see weight loss potentially occurring. So the mantra sort of less is more when it comes to starch really applies even for a poor doer. And it's less common now, but I can remember sort of 18, 20 years ago, people would be feeding bucketfuls of feed, particularly perhaps in the show horse, trying to promote weight gain, get them really highly conditioned. And the evidence is that you're just doing way more harm than good. Most of it's probably coming through being only partially digested and probably causing a lot more problems. So what we really need to do is focus on quality, energy density, and the health of the gut to sort of maximise weight gain and promote good condition. And I've just put on there as a note to really remind me to mention it. If you are interested in the amounts of starch that your horse is consuming, particularly in the context of gastric ulcers and things, there is a recommendation that we don't exceed more than 2 grams of starch per kilo body weight of the horse's body weight per day and 1 gram per meal. Per kilo body weight, then we have a calculator on the website. So do look for that because it's a really easy way. As long as you know the starch value of the feed and how much you're using, it will tell you exactly what level of starch your horse is consuming per meal per day, and obviously whether that's too high. So from the small intestine, we're going to the hindgut. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a combination of the sort of cecum and the large intestine. So the cecum is about 1 meter long, 3 feet long. It's a really big sac-like structure. And the hindgut is where our microbial population live. And these are the guys that break the fibre down by a process called fermentation. And as I've sort of said a few times, time is crucial for this to happen. So really indigestible materials like straw might take up to 3 days, 36 hours, up to 3 days, to be broken down. More digestible fibres, you're probably looking at 24, 36 hours. So the quality of the fibre has a big impact on how quickly the horse is breaking it down. And if we want them to get more out of poorer quality forages, we need to give them time and make sure their gut's healthy. So if we have these sudden changes in diet or a starch overflow into the hindgut, then we see a problem called dysbiosis. So it's the bacteria and the microbial population being disrupted and upset by it. As I mentioned earlier, we say 2 grams per kilo body weight per day and 1 gram per kilo body weight per meal for an ulcer risk. But there's evidence that lower levels of starch than that may well be reaching the hindgut and causing sort of mild to moderate dysbiosis. So anytime that's happening, we start to compromise the health of the gut. The bugs that break down the fibre also produce things like B vitamins, which the most commonly talked about one would be biotin. And obviously we know that helps to generate good, nice, strong, healthy hooves and coat condition. So, the sort of mantra, healthy on the inside, healthy on the outside, holds true. If you look at a horse and it has persistently poor quality hooves and dull stary coat, and as obviously B vitamins are also used in energy metabolism, if your horse isn't performing and it looks poor, then it's a good indication that that hindgut may well be struggling in terms of the microbes that live there. So some sort of digestive aid may be beneficial. And again, we'll look at some specific examples later. Your evidence that something is wrong in a serious way was obviously disease. So things like laminitis, colic, loose droppings. And this again is why meal size is really important. We suggest a maximum of sort of 1.5 kilos really of a starch-based feed per meal. And if you can feed less than that, either by doing lots more meals throughout the day, so each meal size is smaller, or increasing your reliance on fibre and oil rather than using cereals, all to the good. You're reducing your risk of problems. So the other thing to bear in mind also is that when the horse breaks down fibre, it's a fermentation process. They actually give off heat as a byproduct. So again, feeding plenty of fibre, particularly these older horses, or perhaps what we call hot bloods that are quite thin-skinned, and if they're a porrider or underweight, they're not going to have a very thick lining of fat to keep them warm. So the more fibre we can feed them to help keep them warm from the inside, the better as well. So there's some reasons and a bit of an overview of the digestive system and what we're trying to achieve. And I'm going to hand over to Tracy next to talk you through some of the Dengie products and how to use them. So
thank you, Katie. If you can give me control, hopefully.
Should be coming through now, Tracy.
Yes, I think, yay, excellent, that's great, fantastic. So I'm going to give a Feedline perspective on kind of the types of problems that we see, and perhaps some of the Dengie offerings that we have to help you aid weight gain kind of in your horse. The chart on the screen there just shows kind of when people most frequently contact us about their horse or having trouble with their horse's weight. And you can see that there very much is a seasonal effect. This is the Feedline data from last year, but to be honest, most years it follows that similar trend where the number of calls regarding underweights, horses or poor doers starts to increase around October time. And then we're really around our peak now, kind of in January time. And it's quite funny because I just looked at the number of you that were actually watching the kind of webinar and found that there were around 100 of you doing so. So that actually matches our Feedline stats precisely. But there are kind of, again, time and time again, we see this seasonal cycle of weight loss in the winter. And there are kind of many problems, underlying problems that can cause that weight loss, but sometimes it can fundamentally be changes in kind of grazing availability and colder weather that are affecting your horse's weight. And if your horse doesn't have any underlying kind of weight problems, and you know every year that your horse struggles to actually maintain its weight in the winter, it's probably a good idea to start thinking about your winter feeding regime much earlier on in the autumn and start adjusting it so that your horse is actually perhaps carrying a little bit more weight coming into the winter so that they can then afford to lose some as the winter season progresses. There are a number of common questions that we get on the Dengie Feedline, and I'm going to really cover kind of 4 of those off for you. So, are there any supplements I can use to help with weight gain? How can I promote weight gain without excitability? I have to say that's probably the most common one. My horse can't chew forage. What do I do next? And my horse is fussy with feed and forage. What can I feed? So, I have a look at each of those individually. So when it comes to digestive aids to support kind of gut health, this very much is the kind of icing on the cake. So we couldn't just rely on these things alone without taking action to make sure there isn't an underlying problem, or that you're feeding your horse enough energy in the diet to actually make a difference to its weight. But where we can use digestive aids is just to make sure that the horse is utilising its feed as efficiently as possible. So we're just getting as much as possible out of the feed that you're putting in, and that's got to be a good thing. When it comes to using digestive aids, you can either find them as a supplement or perhaps already included in feeds. So for example, the Dengie Healthy Tummy, which is on the screen there, contains something called ADM Protexin in feed formula, and that supplies us with live yeast and prebiotics. So you've got a double whammy of things in there that, in addition to a high calorie product, can help you with weight gain in your horse. And I find this product particularly useful for all sorts of circumstances, but particularly for horses that are poor doers, you know, especially veteran horses, and also because it's low sugar and low starch as well. It's really very useful for that perspective. And you might also see that I've got Alpha Beat on the screen there, and you might be thinking, hold on a minute, that's not a supplement. No, you're quite right, that isn't a supplement, but you may not be aware that sugar beet actually has a natural prebiotic effect. So including some sugar beet in the diet can be really useful for enhancing the digestibility of other fibre sources that are going into the ration. And there was actually some specific research that looked at combining sugar beet with alfalfa, and it found that adding that sugar beet alongside the alfalfa did enhance the digestibility of the alfalfa, so getting more out of what you're putting into the feeding regime. And easy things like that to add to the ration are really helpful for helping with weight gain, and also tend to be really very palatable as well. So going on to my horse can't chew forage, what's next? Well, under normal circumstances, we'd perhaps suggest that extra grass turnout might be a good idea, but obviously that's quite flawed in the winter months, because unfortunately not all of us have access to 24/7 grass turnout in the winter, and it may be dictated by a livery yard that our horses are spending more and more time in the stable, which is why dental problems can be particularly highlighted at this time of year. So if your horse is struggling to chew hay or haylage, your next step would be to try some short chop fibre feeds, and the next step beyond that would be to try an entirely soaked fibre ration. Now, I'm not going to talk about the whys and the wherefores of each of these in today's session, but there is a previous webinar on the veteran horse that has got some dental aspects and how to use hay replacers in that presentation. So that's well worth a look if you would like to. But when it comes to the feeds that we have feeds that can either totally replace the hay ration or partially replace the hay ration. Now, when I'm talking about hay replacers, in this context, I'm not only talking about them for horses with poor dentition, because actually, if you have poor quality forage, or your horse simply isn't enjoying the forage that you have, using a part or total hay replacers for those horses can really make a big difference to their body weight and how well they're maintaining weight as well. And there are undoubtedly some horses that simply just do better with the inclusion of some grass in their diet. So adding a kind of bucket of chopped grass into their stable can literally bring the paddock into the stable, and certainly go a long way to helping them hold their weight as well. You can see we have several total hay replacers on the screen there. Some of them, like the Hi-Fi Light, are low calorie, so obviously not as useful for our poor doers. But you might be surprised if you've actually got a horse who wasn't maintaining their weight because they had poor dentition, and you get the hay replacer right, all of a sudden you might be dealing with one that's suddenly a bit more porky. So it's good to know that there are other options in that regime. But obviously, as you can see there, the Hi-Fi Senior, the grass pellets and the pure grass are the kind of higher calorie options and can be fed ad lib to replace the forage ration. We also have the partial hay replacers, so things like the performance fibre, the meadowgrass with herbs and oil, alpha beet, and again the lower calorie Hi-Fi molasses free. So with these products, the reason that they're kind of part hay replacers rather than total hay replacers is we might step into the territory of oversupplying some nutrients if we fed them ad lib. So for example, with regards to the performance fibre and the meadowgrass with herbs and oil, these both contain high levels of oil in the feed, so we're unable to feed those ad lib. With the alpha beets, again, it's nutrient oversupply that we're worried about. But generally, these can form quite a large part of the ration. So even if your horse, for example, is getting out to the paddock during the day, they can largely replace the hay replacer ration overnight. With things like horses that have got kind of really poor dentition, so they've got to the stage that they've run out of teeth, we would certainly recommend using a soaked ration. And with things like the grass pellets, we would suggest to soak them to a mash if you are feeding them alone, to reduce choke risk in all horses and ponies. And the alpha beet obviously must be fed soaked as well. So one of the really common questions that we get when feeding for weight gain is, well, how do I promote weight gain without sending my horse a bit crazy? Firstly, I'd really like to say it isn't always the feed. I know we're looking for something to blame in these circumstances, but it genuinely isn't always the feed. And at this time of year, we've got other complicating factors. So, for example, our horses may be stabled for longer. We may not be able to exercise them as frequently as we'd like to. And it may be windy with lots of monsters in the hedge. Whichever, all of those things can actually really influence your horse's behaviour beyond feeding itself. But when it comes to feeding, there is evidence and multiple sources of evidence that the choice of energy source can actually influence your horse's behaviour. And for a calmer ride, we generally want to stick to our sources of slow release energy, which are fibre and oil, and avoid quicker release energy sources like starch. And if you have a look on the Dengie website, you can actually see the full behaviour study that we have. But in a nutshell, there was a study at the University of Edinburgh that compared a fibre diet that provided only 2% starch to a medium energy cereal-based concentrate mix with 22% starch. So although there were big differences in the level of starch, the actual amount of energy provided by the diet was the same, which is key. And the feed that was the 2% starch was actually our alpha-A molasses-free that was being used within the study. And the results of this study found that horses fed a cereal-based concentrate mix were overall more reactive to new situations and equipment. So that picture there with that strange flappy curtain is actually part of a standardised behavioural study, and it's how willing the horse was to approach the bucket when it was stood in front of that scary flappy curtain, and even how willing they were to go underneath or through that curtain when they were ridden or exercised. Horses that were fed cereal-based concentrates were also less consistent in their behaviour and had higher heart rates compared to horses fed fibre diets as well. And this isn't the only study that's available. There are others that have looked at oil-based rations, and they've used kind of umbrellas in those studies to be kind of quite reactive and scary. And generally, the message is still there. It's fibre and oil that should be your best friends if you have kind of horses that are kind of a bit prone to being excitable, or certainly in the winter months there are other things compounding the issue. Now, from Dengie's perspective, in terms of the offerings that we have, because all of our fibre feeds are low starch, I wouldn't have an issue with you using kind of any of them if you've got a horse that needs to gain weight and is prone to being overexcitable. But just to demonstrate that alpha-A oil is our highest calorie fibre feed in the Dengie range. It's 12.5 megajoules, so it really is very conditioning. And it is based on entirely slow release energy. So people are often quite surprised to find out that that product is molasses free. So it's really, really low in sugar and starch, but really high in calories. Don't be put off by the fact that it says condition and perform on the bag, or for horses and hard work. Again, that's something that can scare people when they're looking at our feed bags and how kind of high energy or calorie they are. We really use that just as a way to indicate that this is a high calorie kind of product, and it is obviously suitable for working horses, but because it's based on fibre and oil, it's equally suitable for horses that, for example, are on box rest that don't maintain their weight with ease. So it does give you that good option. And you can combine the alpha-A oil again with alpha beet. That can be used alongside any of our fibre-based feeds. And then because that one is a straight, unlike the Healthy Tummy, which was a complete fibre feed, we do need to add some vitamins and minerals alongside, which can either be in the form of a supplement or balancer, and you just pick one simply according to how hard your horse is working. So leisure versions for horses at rest or in light work, or the performance versions for those that are doing that little bit more. So the other big problem that we can have is very much fussy feeders, and this is something that can be really frustrating. I was only chatting to a lady on Feedline this week who was in absolute despair because she was trying so hard to get her horse to eat, and it simply was having kind of none of it, even though she was supplying what should be some really tasty feeds and in good amounts and giving her a good choice. In these situations, I would say it's really important to identify if there is an underlying cause. Obviously, things like gastric ulcers can very much put your horse off of eating, and other problems, particularly for veteran horses, PPID, formerly known as Cushing's, would definitely have that effect, especially when you're starting medication, unfortunately, as well. So we can see it kind of quite commonly. So some tricks to try and help you kind of with fussy feeders that simply won't eat. One of them would be to offer multiple forage sources if they're being fussy with their usual forage ration. And it's really important to keep an eye on the quality of your forage. Anything that's at all kind of dusty could be mouldy, and even if it doesn't smell mouldy to you, it could be very much something the horse is detecting and doesn't want to eat. So forage quality is very important. But offering multiple forage choices is useful because it encourages more foraging behaviour, and ultimately you might find your horse eats that little bit more if they've got a choice. So for example, you could offer a net of hay, a net of haylage, and then a bucket of one of the Dengie grass products like pure grass or meadow grass with herbs and oil, or even something like some of the alpha oil, for example, as an additional choice, an additional option kind of in the stable for your horse to pick at as and when they want to. The other tip that we often give is to offer feeds cafeteria style to establish preference. So what we mean by that is looking at what's going on in that picture. So multiple buckets, one feed per bucket, and that can help you identify if there is a particular food that your horse enjoys and one that they really don't like. Sure as eggs, when you do that, they'll probably eat all the buckets, but never mind, it's worth a try. And sometimes we do need to compromise with these horses. They may not want to eat what we would like them to eat. And so sometimes you may be kind of more beneficial to go for the molasses feed that's a little bit sugary, it's naturally sweeter. They may be more likely to eat it. Or go for a kind of pelleted concentrate, for example, that can be eaten in smaller volumes. Yes, it does contain starch, but as long as you're watching your meal size, then it can be useful for those horses that have really limited appetites. From the Dengie perspective, we do an alfalfa pellet, which is pure pelleted alfalfa. So again, it has a reasonable calorie level to it, and a scoop of that weighs about 1.5 kilos compared to only 400 grams of something like the alpha oil. So if your horse isn't great at eating large volumes of fibre, again, a pelleted version can very definitely help sneak that bit more into them, which overall can again help to increase their calorie intake. So all of those things are kind of really important for them. So now I've kind of whizzed through my section, I'm going to hand over to Claire to tell us a little bit about some of the horses that we've actually worked with.
Brilliant. Okay, so the first horse case study I'd like to talk about is Colin. And Colin is an ex-race horse. He's a young ex-racehorse. He's about 16.1, 16.2, and he was purchased by Leah in sort of late 2019. He was in quite poor condition when he arrived, and Leah really struggled to sort of get him to even maintain his weight. Sort of the first winter, she was really struggling with him. I think these ex-racers are sort of notoriously difficult. They tend to be quite poor doers and need sort of more calories in their ration than perhaps other breeds. And I think coming out of racing, it's such a big change for these horses. Sort of looking at Colin, I suspect he's had some time out sort of prior to sort of going to Leah, so he's lacking sort of muscle, but if you have them straight from the racetrack, then they're going to change in their sort of physical sort of shape, sort of let down some of those racing muscles, and it's such a big change. So I think with these horses, it often does take time to see the change in them. Colin needed to gain weight, but he was also very fizzy and very reactive to the feeds that he was getting. So Leah had put him onto a conditioning feed, a concentrate feed, to help with his weight, but his behaviour then became sort of worse, and he became quite sort of tricky. So it became sort of a bit of a cycle. Leah was also concerned that Colin had some ulcery symptoms, and he was actually scoped later on, and he did have squamous ulcers, which were then treated with omeprazole. And I think once he had had his ulcers treated, his appetite then sort of improved as well. So particularly when he was on the omeprazole, that seemed to affect his appetite, and she was concerned about him not eating. He could also be prone to loose droppings, which again is just an indication that his gut isn't as healthy as it could be. So that was something that we needed to sort of have a look at. And he also had a tooth infection in sort of 2020, sort of, I think it was like March, April time, and subsequently had a tooth removed. And again, that would affect his eating ability. Katie did talk a little bit more about sort of dental health, and this is something that is really important. If their teeth hurt, then it's going to affect their ability to eat. Luckily for Colin, the tooth was removed and the problem then went away. So we made some recommendations for Colin. He was turned out, Leah actually moved where they had much better grazing, so he was able to have more turnout, more grass. And we recommended a ration of Healthy Tummy and Alpha Beet. So he was fed 2.5 kilos of Healthy Tummy per day and 1 kilo dry weight of Alpha Beet, which was then soaked prior to feeding. And he also got half a scoop extra of Healthy Tummy, which he was fed prior to exercise, to help make sure he had a fibrous mat in his stomach to help reduce sort of acid splash, and to help with the sort of ulcer situation. He ate the feed very well, so his appetite, as I say, improved once the ulcers and the dental issue was resolved. These photos are both from within the last couple of weeks. So Leah is absolutely delighted with the results, and the fact that he's continued to do so well on this ration. So he's actually been fed this diet for nearly 2 years. You can see that first picture of him in his stable. So we're in the winter months, which is the time that obviously they were struggling most with his weight, and his ribs are well covered. His muscle tone is improved. You can see he's shiny, and he's tucking into his feed, which is a really good sign. Leah reported that his loose droppings had cleared up after a week on his new diet, and that within 2 weeks he was less swishy and fidgety when she was girthing up. So I think really it's important to sort of, I suppose, understand that part of the problems that I think Colin had was the health issues, so the dental issue and the ulcers. So getting the right diet, providing the right type of energy to give him the calories and reduce the sort of behavioural issues have all been really, really important in terms of helping him to gain weight and to sort of become a healthier horse. But Colin, Leah has reported that he's thriving on his new diet. He's gained 80 kilos since he started on that ration, and she's really happy with his condition now, and even as we approach or in the winter, that he's still doing really, really well, and that he's a much happier horse for this fibre diet. So really, really pleased with those results. So the next horse I want to discuss and share his story with you is Rommel. And Rommel was rehomed to Elijah from the Bransby Horses Rescue and Welfare Charity based in Lincolnshire. And Elijah rehomed Rommel in January 2018, shortly after he arrived with the charity. Rommel is 12-year-old, 17-2 Hanoverian, and he had obviously had sort of a troubled sort of background, and he was very stressed. Elijah described him as being agoraphobic. He didn't settle very well. He didn't like going out in the field and wouldn't graze when turned out. He'd been more inclined to box walk, which obviously wasn't helping him. And I think the biggest struggle was getting him to eat sort of anything upon his arrival. So his forage, he wouldn't eat the forage or his bucket feed, which was obviously causing a problem. So that seemed to be the biggest issue. And he actually, I think, lost some further weight once he had arrived. So here's a picture of him looking, I think, a little bit tucked up. You can see it's quite angular through his quarters, his shoulders quite prominent. And this photo was taken in March 2018. So Elijah got him checked out for ulcers, which were ruled out, which is sort of, I think, quite amazing given the horse was so stressy, but is obviously good and really good that Elijah has had him scoped to check for that. And he said the biggest challenge initially was getting him to eat. So he was tempted with some soaked grass pellets, and the grass pellets are naturally a little bit sweeter. So these combined with the alpha-8 oil and alpha beet. So thinking about, I suppose, Tracy's mention of multiple forage sources, but this really helped to get him eating and providing those extra calories that he needs. The ration was also balanced with the performance vitamins to make sure that we're providing him with those vitamins and minerals that he needs, that we're providing him with a balanced diet to support sort of skin and hoof health. And Elijah began bringing him back into work slowly to help build up the important top line that he was lacking, and within a few weeks he could see those changes in both his appetite and his waistline. And I think with the sort of top line, thinking about top line, quite often horses that are leaner, they will have been using some of those sort of muscle stores to provide some energy if they're in a negative energy balance. So providing them with enough energy, enough calories, but also those important building blocks with a quality protein is really important. So alfalfa is actually such a really good source of quality protein that is very good for these horses where they are sort of lacking muscle tone. So this picture is from November 2018, and I think you will agree that Rommel is looking much, much better. And Elijah's done a fantastic job of building that top line. He's sort of well covered and looking really good, sort of heading into winter. And Elijah was delighted with the sort of results. I think it's been a challenge in mastering how to keep him calm and settled, and then therefore keeping him sort of eating. But as I say, I think you'll agree that he's looking much, much better, and he's done a fantastic job. So I will pass over to Katie, who is just going to finish off.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire. Thanks, Tracy, as well. And I think those two case studies hopefully give you confidence that fibre, predominantly fibre diets with some oil and obviously balance, can actually really achieve great results. And there is a balance to be struck between time and the diet itself, but obviously work helps contribute to muscle tone and top line development too. But you don't have to use high levels of cereals to achieve that sort of weight gain that we're looking for. So just some key take-home messages really from this evening. And when we're trying to promote weight gain, grazing is that most digestible source of fibre that's available to us in most cases. Obviously, it varies throughout the year, but if we can make use of it, it certainly is going to make a big contribution in many cases. I think Leah moving yards with Colin says it all. If there's good grass available, make the most of it. The situation with Rommel is a bit different because he was quite agoraphobic and didn't like being out there. So it doesn't necessarily suit all horses, but if they're happy out eating, then make use of that really digestible source of fibre. And then when we look at forage, we're trying to get as digestible as possible. And I think we've covered it in sort of various other webinars as well. But just to reiterate the point that when you harvest forage, the earlier you can get it, so particularly in hay and haylage terms, the more digestible it's likely to be. A younger plant is less fibrous, less digestible. It's still obviously a high fibre material, but more of that fibre is easier for the horse to break down and will actually contribute more to helping them promote weight gain. So earlier cuts, soft leafy forages, so have a good squeeze of them. If they look soft and feel soft and this nice leafy content, as opposed to something that looks like straw, then they're the ones for your poor doer because they're more digestible and they'll get more from it. And we always find that change, usually in sort of September, October time, when the grass starts to go off, you have to use more hay, and that's really a critical time and often when the weight loss process can start. And particularly in older horses or anyone that's struggling to get the forage digested, they're going to start to lose weight the moment you start to make those changes. So do watch out for that and try and take action before they've lost weight if you can. The bucket feed, so again, Tracy demonstrated really nicely there how you can use highly digestible fibre sources. The other ingredient that you can make use of and is becoming increasingly popular is something like micronized linseed. So again, I think feeding rates up to 500 grams a day, and that's a really nice way to top up on a fibre-based ration, because it usually comes in a linseed meal that's all been cooked for you. So micronized linseed is safe to use. You don't have the hassle of boiling it up like we used to have to do ourselves 20 years ago, but it's low starch and again a concentrated feeding rate. So for these fussy horses with limited appetites, you don't have to use huge amounts to get high calorie content in there. So oil is about 35-40 megajoules per kilo of digestible energy. So the energy trapped in that oil is very high and well worth making use of. As we've said, low starch for gut health, there are always exceptions. If you literally cannot persuade a horse to eat enough forage, enough fibre-based materials to get them to put weight on and condition, then of course you've got to use something that might have a bit of starch and a bit of cereal in there. But moderation is key, meal size, really important. And when you're using the fibre sources as a bucket feed, do make sure you feed enough of them. Claire gave some feeding rates there. 2.5 kilos of healthy tummy a day did the job, but 2.5 kilos is actually 5 scoops. A scoop is a large Stubbs one is about half a kilo of healthy tummy. So the volume needs to be there. It always feels like you're feeding lots, but because it's fibre, you can feed a large amount, even though it's going in the bucket. It's the starchy cereal-based feeds you have to feed in moderation when you're using them as a bucket feed. So that's why we're saying sort of feed plenty in the context of fibre feeds. And the digestive aid, the more we can do to help make the gut efficient, and the microbial population, as we've shown, they are so important for lots of different things, whether it's keeping the horse warm from the inside, producing the B vitamins that help them look good and give that beautiful shine and good quality hoof horn. All of those things depend on having a good microbial population in the gut. And anytime that you see loose droppings or indications that things are passing through the gut more quickly, it is going to potentially cause a disruption to that microbial population as well. Those bacteria need time to reproduce and maintain their populations and keep them healthy. And as soon as the good guys, the good bugs, are compromised, in other words, if they've been carried out of the gut or we've put too much starch into that hindgut, we actually then allow the bad ones, the potentially harmful pathogenic bacteria, the opportunity to come and become established and potentially cause further disease and more serious problems as well. And obviously things like colic can occur as a result. So all of those are things that you need to think about. So hopefully we've covered the key concepts and given you some examples, and hopefully given you the confidence that you can promote weight gain. If you use the right products in the right quantities, you can get results. Now, the team have been busying away behind the scenes doing some Q&As, but if you haven't had a response yet, apologies, we will get to them. As I say, this is designed to be a sort of express webinar, trying to keep it to an hour so we don't take up too much of your evening. But if you do want to contact Feedline, please contact them via the emails. We have a ration evaluation form on the website as well, so you can put all the information about your horse in there, which is really helpful for us. The more information you can give us, the more better response we can provide to you. But I'd just like to thank Tracy and Claire, who are popping up on my screen. I'm not sure whether you can ever see them, but they are there. So thank you, Tracy. Thanks, Claire, for really interesting insights. And thank you very much to everyone who's joined us this evening. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Take care.